those of this station, its staff, management, or sponsors.
Are you a family caregiver? Are you caregiving for someone who can no longer take care of themselves? Are you overwhelmed? This is Caregiver Solutions Info with Marcia Teal. Marcia will be hosting an hour of true stories and information, tips and updates of the latest research and necessary information in the caregiving field, focusing on you, the family caregiver. An Alzheimer's disease and dementia care expert, Marcia has 15 years of hands-on experience at Arden Courts, a leader in assisted living dementia communities here in the U.S. Marcia covers everything you need to know as a family caregiver, especially if you care for a loved one with Alzheimer's disease or other related dementia or chronic illness. If you have a friend or relative that is also a family caregiver, call them now. They won't want to miss a minute. And let them know they can watch on caregiversolutions.info. And they can listen on WNN 1470 AM in South Florida or nationally on the iHeartRadio app. Now, sit back, relax, and learn from our host, Marcia Teal, as she brings information to you that may just be the caregiving solution you need.
Hello, and welcome to Caregiver Solutions Info Show. I'm Marcia Teal. I'm so glad you could join us today. We have a great show for you. This is a program for caregivers, people who take care of other people who can't care for themselves. We also focus a lot on dementia and what all that means and caregiving for dementia. So if you're a caregiver, you're in the right place, and I hope that you will learn from this, as it's a great educational platform, another way to find out about what you need to know on your journey of caregiving. In this year, 2020, we've experienced a lot of loss. With this COVID-19, the pandemic, people have lost their lives. People have lost their jobs. People have lost opportunities. People have lost the freedom to be able to go and do the things that they used to do. So there's been a lot of loss this year, and it's a terrible thing, and it hasn't really stopped, and it's ongoing. And we want to address that because with loss comes grief. So today we're going to be talking about loss and the grief that accompanies that. So today there are two gentlemen who are joining me via our program here, one from Ohio and one from Colorado, and they're going to be talking about their experiences, what grief means to them, what grief has impacted them, how it's impacted them, and what they are doing about it. So I'm happy to welcome to the show today from Colorado, Jason Mueller, and also Dan Hettinger. Welcome. Thank you for being here.
Hi, Marcia. Thank you for having us.
So this is a topic that sometimes people don't like to talk about. You know, it's sad. It's depressing. But it's something that everybody goes through at some point or point in their life. So Jason, you know, I'd like to start with you. You shared a lot of your experiences with me before the show, and you've been on a journey through this grief process, and you call it a journey. After the tragic, violent death of your 19-year-old son 2.5 years ago. You can't imagine what you felt and what you were going through, but can you just describe, you know, and give us some words of the feelings that you had when this all first happened?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, 2.5 years ago when, you know, you get the worst phone call that you could possibly imagine getting, it just becomes a feeling of just feeling lost and angry and just sad and confused. And then over time, those feelings start to turn into a whole nother, you know, group of feelings. But I would say, initially, those were probably some of the initial feelings.
Well, I'm so sorry for your loss and that you had to go through that, you and your family. Someone who's 19 years old and have their whole life ahead of them, for that to be taken away is such a tragedy. You described to me that grief, you're on a journey. It's not just you go through grief, but you're on this journey of grief. Why do you describe it as a journey?
So, your journey through grief was a title that Dan and I came up with the workshops that we do. And for us, it is a journey. And when you think of a journey maybe doesn't necessarily always head in one direction. A journey may not have a final destination. And so when I think of my journey, my journey through grief is going to be a lifelong journey. And it's going to be, I'm going to continue to go through phases, and I may go back in phases, different stages of grief and different feelings, but it is something that somebody is on. But, I also like to look at it that this is one journey that really nobody should have to go through alone.
Absolutely. It is a process, right? It's something that a process and a journey is different for every person, and a journey takes different people different places. So I think that's a very appropriate word to describe it. So Dan, you met Jason at the time that his tragedy happened. Tell me how you met, and tell me how you helped Jason in the initial days of this tragic event that he experienced.
Jason was referred to me by the pastor of our church. Grief is a subject that I care very much about due to my professional life in hospice and hospital work, and the role that I play in the church as congregational care. Jason's story, though, was very compelling, because here's a young dad who lost a young son, and it just is heartbreaking beyond most grief. I mean, all grief is sad, all grief is difficult, and all grief is loss, as you said. And there's so many different kinds of grief and so many different reasons for grief. But clearly Jason's story of losing a 19-year-old son was very tragic, and his wounds were very fresh. When we met, he was having problems just going through a day without weeping, for being able to go to work. This is what he was telling me. And so Jason and I just started meeting together. The phrase we use is, I was the person in the other chair, listening to Jason's tragedy, getting Jason to express and identify and express the painful feelings, the thoughts. And I enjoyed hearing about his son. I enjoyed hearing him mention his son's name and talk about his son and talk about his son's heart to care and the big role his son had in their family. And the amazing thing is, I didn't do too much, to be really honest with you, to be perfectly clear. I just was present with Jason in his pain. And Jason was able to identify and express his pain to me because I was willing to listen and because I cared about him. And that caring made me care more, and it became a journey, but also the building of a strong friendship, because I value Jason and his journey through grief enormously, and I have great respect for him.
That's wonderful, Jason. You had such a caring person that came into your life at the time that you needed it, which was great. And through the process of talking with Dan, Jason, eventually you decided to get involved in this grief counseling, grief ministry. Why did you do that? What was your intention? What were you hoping to accomplish by sort of partnering up with Dan in a grief ministry?
Well, some of the things that we talk about in our workshops is, we talk about as you go through your journey, you get to a stage where you start to organize things and you start to want to maybe get back to a normal life, but you also start to focus on how can I honor, my loved one that I lost. The biggest way that I could honor Austin was to be there to help others. Austin had a heart that, he would drop anything at any time, and he would, almost to an aggravation point as a dad, he would leave work, he would call in sick to work, he would do different things just to go help people. And he had a heart that, he'd give you the shirt off his back. So, I looked for different ways to honor him. It took me a couple of years to really figure out, and especially a year plus of talking with Dan, that this was the best way that I could do it, was to be there for other people and to help them get through whatever they needed to get through.
So you mentioned workshops. So describe to me the format of how your grief counseling, grief ministry works, the workshop part of it. How does that work for helping others?
There are some great grief programs out there. I would recommend people check out Grief Share. That's a good one. There's lots of different workshops. We wanted to find one. We used material that I had written. We wanted to make it very simple. We wanted to make it so people could attend who don't want to go every week, but who maybe want to go a few times a year, who want to go when they're having a crisis. And that's another reason we call it a journey through grief, so people can just stop in on their journey and find some direction for how to get through to the next destination. So we have one workshop that we call filling the other chair. Can you find somebody who will sit in the other chair with you like I did with Jason? We talk about that in great detail. We have a workshop where we talk about understanding the stages of grief and setting a goal for your grief, so people don't just feel lost but can find where they're going on this journey. And then we have some events too, like we do a Blue Christmas service, because not everybody feels like fa la 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 at Christmas time. It might be their first Christmas without their spouse or their child or their parent, and they want to honor their parent, they want to celebrate Christmas, they want to find hope, but they want a different kind of service. So this particular rotation of workshops, we're having that as one of the ways of honoring their loved ones.
Wow, that is awesome. I think that is so needed, and it's such a wonderful thing to hear that you all are doing. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk more about grief and loss with these two wonderful gentlemen. So stay with us. We'll be right back.
Arden Courts is not just a place to live, it's a place to call home. Residential living combined with quality caregiving. This is the philosophy behind Arden Courts. Communities created exclusively for individuals with Alzheimer's disease and related dementia who would benefit from a safe and structured environment. For additional information about any of the unique services Arden Courts provides, call 888-478-2410 to locate a community nearest you. Inquire about our educational seminars, resource library, or support groups, or simply feel free to ask questions you may have about Alzheimer's and related dementias. At Arden Courts, we know, we understand, and we can help because memory care is all we do. Remember, call 888-478-2410 for additional information about any of the unique services Arden Courts provides. You are listening to your host, Marcia Teal, an Alzheimer's disease and dementia care expert on CaregiverSolutions.info. If you have a question or wish to share a story, call into the show at 888-565-1470 and talk with Marcia. Now, back to Caregiver Solutions.
Joining me today is Jason Mueller, who lost his 19-year-old son 2.5 years ago in a tragic, violent death. So he's been a grieving dad ever since. And also with me today is Dan Hettinger. And Dan is a chaplain. He's been a hospice chaplain. He's a hospice chaplain. He has chaplain in medical centers, a behavioral and addiction hospital, and is the pastor of a congregational care group from Mountain View Christian Church. And he continues to be part of that. He's joining us from Ohio. So we've been talking about grief, loss. So Jason, your obviously loss, your grief stems from the loss of your son. And these workshops that you and Dan are doing, are they only for people who have lost a loved one, or are there other types of loss that you identify and deal with in your workshops?
Well, Marcia, it's a great question, and it's something that in the beginning of my journey, I didn't understand that answer. There are so many different levels of grief and so many different levels of loss. Losing a loved one, obviously, I think is something that probably commonly just pops into somebody's head and we all think of. But, you could be going through a divorce that causes grief, a bad breakup, loss of a job, loss of a financial status. During times like right now with COVID, people could be experiencing grief through that. Loss of a pet. We've experienced a couple individuals that, a pet was a big part of their life. And so they lost that. So definitely lots of different ways to express a loss.
Absolutely. And Dan, I want to say Chaplain Dan, you've been helping people for many, many years through the church, through the hospice, obviously with a lot of grief counseling. Is the grief process the same when people are grieving different losses? Is the process the same, and why or why not?
Well, that's a complicated question, and I will try to give a simple answer. There are some things that almost everybody goes through. And then but every person's journey is unique to them because different personalities respond differently emotionally. Some are more emotionally intense. Some people are more introverted. So really, everybody's journey is unique to them as a person. But that being said, there's general stages of grief. There is that first phase of shock and numb and unbelief. And actually, shock's a bit of a gift that helps us get through the first few weeks where we just don't know how we can even put one foot in front of the other. But when the shock goes away, the pain sets in. And the next part is that acute and highly emotional grief. Now, again, that's a little bit different for everybody. But this is where the deep anguish, where the yearning, the trying to replace the loved one, hoping you see them again, just waiting for them to walk through the door, for your phone to ring, and it's from them. And it, again, the uniqueness is for some people that loss lasts a long time. Other people get through that a little bit more quickly. As you move through that phase, you come to the time when you do start, the acuteness of the pain, the severity of the pain begins to subside a little bit. And if you've been grieving appropriately, you start to experience some inner healing. And you start wanting to live again. And at that time, you organize your life. Maybe you redefine the loss. and it never goes away. You always live with a piece of you missing, but you learn how to do it. And then you make a goal for how you want to honor that loved one, how you want to remember them, the place they will always have in your life and your memory. Now, those stages of grief that I just described to you, a lot of people are not that aware of. They are articulated by John Bowlby, who did a lot of his work on attachment issues with children back in the, I guess almost 100 years ago now. But many people are familiar with Kubler-Ross's stages, but Kubler-Ross's are really more states of grief. They're not stages because they're not linear, but the way Bowlby describes it, it is a little bit more, this is the beginning, and then this is the end, and this is your journey from the beginning to the end. Kubler-Ross, it's the shock, but there's the anger and bargaining, but you can go from 1 to 3 to back to 2 to 4 to 5. That's why I greatly respect what she came up with and has found it valuable and helpful to many people. But I choose to talk about the journey and the process of grieving using Bowlby.
Well, you said something a minute ago that I want you to expound on, and that was if somebody grieves appropriately. What do you mean by appropriately?
Thank you for asking that question. A phrase that I use a lot is grief is the most common human experience. Grief finds everybody. Nobody avoids grief. But grief is a noun. Grieving is a verb. We don't have a choice of whether or not we can find grief, because grief will find us. But we do have a choice of whether or not we will grieve. And we are not a good grieving culture. We're actually the most medicated culture in the world. We simply try to make our pain go away. Many times we just put our shoulder to the plow and just keep moving forward. Or sometimes we find unhealthy ways of coping, perhaps alcohol or withdrawal, leading into deep, long stages of depression that change our life. But when a person grieves, when they grieve, they learn how to express their pain and their loss in some way, and again, we call it to the person in the other chair. Now, if you can find somebody like that who will listen to you, it might be a counselor, it might be a pastor. If your church has a Stephen ministry, Stephen ministers are trained to be good listeners. They're some of the best lay listeners in the world. You may have a really wonderful friend. If you cannot find that person though, and it's hard because those kind of people are rare, and most people want to give you advice and tell you to get over it, and they don't really want to listen for a long time and ask questions and learn your story. I encourage people to journal and even picture God sitting in that other chair. And take a real chair, put it next to your bed at night, and when you lay down, look at that chair and express your pain. Or when you're up in the morning and you're sitting at the table alone, look at that other chair and express your pain, because something amazing happens when you can express your pain to someone in the other chair. And if you don't have someone, just remember God cares about your pain, and he's sitting in that other chair and he's listening. Express it. I had one of these experiences yesterday, actually. It was an anniversary death of a person's father. And I said, "Hey, how you doing today?" And not good at all. and they told me the anniversary date of their father's death. They told me some of the complicating factors. Do you know what? I didn't do anything. I just asked a few questions. I just listened to them. They told me their story, and they said, you know what? It feels better just to have somebody listen to me. And I went, it worked again. It worked again. I just listened, and they think I'm wonderful. They think I helped them. And all I did was listen and ask them questions and actually care, because when people express, so when I talk about appropriately grieving, when people are intentionally grieving, the verb, choosing to grieve, Jason grieved. Jason sought me out. And he sat in one chair and he told me his story as I listened to it. Jason did not go into hiding. He did not just become bitter. He did not become a workaholic. He did not become an alcoholic. He sought somebody out to talk to me about his story. And that's why Jason has moved through this process so beautifully. He still hurts. He hurts terribly, misses his son. We talk about that still. He still cries about it. But he is healthy inside because he's expressed it. And people need to express it. And that is the choice to grieve.
Well, I think what you said about finding someone to listen, and sometimes your friend is not the best person because they want to help, so they try to tell you what to do and or get over it or just do different things because they don't understand. They're not trained. They're not a professional. So I think that's really great advice to seek out a professional, whether it's a pastor or even a medical professional who understands, but somebody who's been, trained in this and who's trained to listen. Like you said, listening is the best thing because people, they don't want to be told how to feel, and I have a friend who lost her son in a tragic accident in Colorado on a ATV going up a mountain, and he was in his 40s. So that was just a tragic accident too. And she expressed to me sometime after, within, the first 6 months, that another friend of hers just was kind of telling her to get over it, and that angered her, and it really upset her. So, I agree, listening is the best thing to do. Yeah, absolutely.
It really is the necessary thing to do. We must be good listeners. That's another thing Jason and I do in our workshops is we tell people how to sit in the other chair and be a listener also. It isn't just telling people who are grieving how to find help, but telling family members how they can listen. I really blew it 30 years ago. One of the reasons I'm passionate about this is because I've done it wrong sometimes. And when my wife's mother died over 30 years ago, and I was a young man and we were a young couple with 2 little boys, I wanted her to get over it. And I thought, your mom's in heaven, let's get going, let's get back to living. I deeply regret that. I think I caused scars in my wife just by my impatience in her grief and my constant advice on what she needed to do to feel better. If I would have just been patient enough to listen, to let her cry, to let her go through the deep, gut-wrenching anguish phase of grief, I have a feeling it would have helped our whole marriage. It would have helped her be emotionally healthier, and that would have blessed her through her whole life. I would encourage your listeners to just Google what not to say to a grieving person. There's some really good stuff on the internet, lists of what not to say. Well, they're in a better place. Well, of course they are, but we're not. Well, God needed another angel. God doesn't need any more angels. I need my loved one. The things people say, after miscarriages, well, you can have another one, or a child dies, aren't you glad you had two more? Or aren't you glad you had them for 8 years? You know, and all of those comments are well-meaning. I mean, people don't say that to be mean, but they are the most hurtful and divisive types of comments. So just Google what not to say to a grieving person and read that list and know that I've said most of them, so I'm not throwing stones at anybody. I'm just saying I won't ever do it again.
Well, thank you for that. That's really important because we find ourselves in situations where we don't know what to say. And I think sometimes just saying, I'm sorry, I'm here for you, is all we can say. We got to go to a half show time break, but we'll be right back with more from these wonderful men talking about grief and grieving and how to help. So we'll be right back.
Arden Courts is not just a place to live, it's a place to call home. Residential living combined with quality caregiving. This is the philosophy behind Arden Courts. Communities created exclusively for individuals with Alzheimer's disease and related dementia who would benefit from a safe and structured environment. For additional information about any of the unique services Arden Courts provides, call 888-478-2410 to locate a community nearest you. Inquire about our educational seminars, resource library, or support groups, or simply feel free to ask questions you may have about Alzheimer's and related dementias. At Arden Courts, we know, we understand, and we can help because memory care is all we do. Remember, call 888-478-2410 for additional information about any of the unique services Arden Courts provides. You are listening to your host, Marcia Teal, an Alzheimer's disease and dementia care expert on caregiversolutions.info. If you have a question or wish to share a story, call into the show at 888-565-1470 and talk with Marcia. Now, back to Caregiver Solutions.
I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our national sponsor for this show. That is Arden Courts Memory Care Community. Arden Courts has about 50 memory care assisted livings throughout the United States, and they're there to help the caregivers when the caregiver cannot do it alone any longer. It's such a difficult thing, especially when you're dealing with Alzheimer's and dementia. Caregiving is something that we sometimes are thrown into, and we have to go on a caregiving journey to learn how to do it. This is a book that Arden Courts would like to offer you absolutely free just for tuning into the show. It's called The 36-Hour Day. Caregivers have expressed in the past that they have to fit everything into a 24-hour day, and it feels like it's a 36-hour day. So this book is very helpful. It's a great resource for caregivers, and it's free. And all you have to do to get it is just send an email with your name, address, and telephone number and say that you heard about the free offer on the Caregiver Solution Info Show. That email address is delray@arden-courts.com. Again, Delray, DELRAY, at Arden, ARDEN, courts, COURTS.com. So please email, tell them that you'd like to have this book. I highly recommend it. It's a great book to have. You can read it from cover to cover or pick and choose the topics when something comes up that you need to research. So caregiving is something that is very difficult, but it can be better when you have help. And this is help that you can have and help here on the Caregiver Solutions Info Show. So thank you for tuning in. And now back to our guests. So my special guests today, we have Dan Hettinger and Jason Mueller. Jason unfortunately lost his 19-year-old son 2.5 years ago to a tragic, violent death, and he's a grieving father. And Dan Hettinger is a pastor, chaplain in many areas through hospice and through the church. and the two of you partnered to help others through workshops dealing with grief. So, Pastor Dan, I want to ask you a question. You're a man of God, and you help a lot of people, and people look to you for answers. Why? Why did this happen? In Jason's case, for example, how can you explain the loss of a young, healthy person, the untimely death of somebody? Not everybody grows old and dies a natural death. What can you say as a pastor? How do you explain this?
Well, you've asked me the ultimate question. How many times has that question been asked? Why? And how many people in any kinds of suffering? Why? Why, God, do you do this? And if we believe in a God who is loving, why does he allow such anguish and pain? If we believe in a God who's powerful, why doesn't he do something about it? And that creates such a conundrum. To address the question, when I'm with a loved one, I do not try to explain it because I have no explanation. I try to empathize with the person's pain and with the person's anguish. And we might together cry out to God, why? We don't understand. This doesn't make sense. In everything we know and believe about life and God and what we want, we are just sad. We are having what St. John of the Cross called a dark night of the soul, where life doesn't make sense and our emotions are in anguish. And it can just be in so many different ways. But I'm often asked, why is there suffering in the world? Now, if I'm in a theological class, I might talk about the sovereignty of God. I might quote Calvin, John Calvin, where he said, God will never allow a hurt so big that he cannot heal. So if I'm in a theological class and we're discussing sovereignty and predestination and God's plan and different things, I may say that. But if a grieving dad asks me why, I don't venture a lame answer, because really no answer other than bringing the son back is going to satisfy the question anyway. I try to empathize with the anguish and the pain. I'm not dodging your question. That's the way I deal with it.
I know. I know that was a tough question. And
that's a fair question.
Thank you.
It's a fair question.
Fair but tough. Which brings me to you, back to you, Jason. After 2.5 years after Austin died, would you care to share where you are on this grief journey that you've been going through?
Well, I would like to think that, I'm in the honoring part with doing the grief work that Dan and I are doing together. And one of the things that Dan mentioned earlier, the Stephen Minister program. I've recently been commissioned as a Stephen Minister in our church. Again, it was just another extension of how can I help people? How can I be in front of somebody? And I mean, the Stephen Minister, when I look at it, it's the ultimate other chair. And that for me was just another way for me to do it. But it's like I said earlier, you're going to go back and forth. And I think Dan hit on it too. You're going to go to stage 2, stage 5, stage 8, 4, 3, just whatever it is, you're going to go back and forth. And I have those moments. Dan mentioned earlier that I still cry about it. And I do. I had a moment probably a month ago where just a picture just kind of set me off. And so it just happens. But you just continue to move forward. And, where I'm at today versus where I was when I met Dan is just completely different places. And I would like to believe that my faith and just my desire to continue to honor Austin through God just really puts me at that stage of just continuing to honor.
Yeah, that's a beautiful thing to honor a life. That really is. Pastor Dan, I have another tough question for you. This is Thanksgiving time, the month of November. Thanksgiving is upon us. And that's a time when we all think about being grateful and giving thanks. What advice would you or could you give to grief sufferers, especially now at the holiday time of year?
When I said your question was a tough one, I want to clarify. It was a fair question. You can ask me those tough questions, because I think when we're talking about grief, if we don't go where we have the toughest questions, it's not an adequate conversation. And as we're approaching the holidays, it is an excruciatingly difficult time for people, especially if it's their first Thanksgiving, their first Christmas. Now we have a different meaning to the empty chair. The person that was sitting there last year isn't. And this might even be harder to answer than the previous one. I would say, first of all, it's different for everyone. Some people want to have somewhat of a normal Christmas, a normal Thanksgiving. Other people are just not ready for it yet. So I would say, number one, do what you feel you can do. Don't let other people force you to do something you can't do. If you don't feel like having the big dinner, and maybe you're the mom who cooked it and fixed it and had a house full of people over, but your husband's not there this year, if you don't want to do it, just tell them, I can't do it this year. And that should be okay. Somebody will be upset, but it's about you and your grief. On the other hand, if you think that's the best thing you can do for yourself and to honor the memory of your husband that used to carve the turkey, then by all means do it. So it isn't a formula of what to do and what not to do. It's do what you feel you can do. So be intentional. In your grieving process, say, this is how I'm feeling. This is what I feel like I can do. This is what I feel like I want to do. Now, there's a handy little book that I've referred to a lot of times. It's got a lot of wonderful ideas in it. It's called A Decembered Grief. And it just has a lot of ideas. I think it's a good book for pastors to have. It wouldn't be a bad thing to have in a doctor's office. Or for you to have and to share with your people. Just through the month of December, read a different idea every day, because they're short little vignettes of things people do. I have some good friends, and Jason knows these people. They go to our church. They had a special needs daughter that was very precious to them. And then they lost her, and when she passed, they have never been able to celebrate Christmas the same way. And here's the one thing they do. They hang their Christmas tree upside down. It looks bizarre when you go into their house because it's an upside down Christmas tree. And it sort of makes you laugh. It sort of makes you smile. It sort of makes you ache. But they said not having her at Christmas has just turned our Christmas upside down. And so that's part of the way they do it. And everybody that comes into their house, they get to talk about their daughter. And yet they do have a Christmas tree up, and they are celebrating Christmas, but it's different. It's not the same way. So they're the only people I've ever seen do it. I'm not suggesting people do it. I'm just saying I know a family that did. It seems to be working for them.
So what I hear you saying is everybody will find their own way to celebrate or not to celebrate, whatever's good for them. They really have to do some soul searching and not let other people unduly influence them, because only a person knows what's best for them. And obviously your friends, found a way, and, good for them. And I think it's great too when people say, why do you do that? If they haven't heard, they don't know them, maybe they're new to the family, and they get to talk about the daughter and talk about, their relationship with her and share, her life and share her story. So I think that's wonderful. Jason, there's another tragedy in your life I'd like to mention and talk a little bit about regarding your mom. And I say it's a tragedy, and I think that it's also considered a part of grieving. Let's talk a little bit about your mom and the fact that you shared with me that she has dementia. When I work with caregivers all the time for the last 20 years that are dealing with a loved one, with dementia. And I see them grieving. They're grieving the loss of a person's life, and they're grieving the loss of the person's brain diminishing and, kind of melting away. And so since we're talking about grief, you had agreed that we could share your story about your mom. So, Jason, how has this affected you and your family with your mother being diagnosed with dementia?
Well, Marcia, it's affected my dad and my older brother who live there locally, and they see and they deal with mom day to day. Probably a little bit deeper and more than it's affected me, just because with being out here, I don't get to see that, and I don't have to witness it and experience it. I guess with me, it's affected me from a sense of, I can't call my mom and talk to her because she is really at a point now where maybe she knows who she's talking to, maybe she doesn't. We don't do different things, Zoom calls with, my girls to be able to see grandma or talk to grandma, because again, maybe she'll know, maybe she won't. So I those things, obviously they bother you and you worry about them. I worry a lot obviously about my mom, but the grief, and I think the things that my dad is going through, and just kind of watching his wife of 44, 45 years, just not the same person that she was, and some of the things that he now has to take on, which, can be overwhelming, I'm sure. I think I get aggravated with my dad more than anything, because sometimes I think he gets aggravated at the situation, but I have to remind myself that I'm not involved in that situation. So I can't speak for how he feels, but I think it's been very, very frustrating and just kind of hurtful to see the process unfolding.
And, a lot of caregivers call this the long goodbye, because it's not a sudden death like something that you've experienced with your son, but the person is slowly dying in front of them because they're just deteriorating, every single day, and you're saying goodbye to a little piece of that person every day. Pastor Dan, would you like to weigh in on this and talk a little bit about how families cope, how you've experienced your experience with families coping with an Alzheimer's diagnosis?
Just last week, I got a letter from a man in my church who lost his wife twice. He lost her to frontal lobe dementia and Alzheimer's. It has a little bit more complicated name. I can't remember it. It's one of the worst that so affected her behavior, and she went from a sweet and loving person to a very angry and even abusive person. And then he lost her to death. And his response to me, he just talked about the different stages he went through, and talks a lot about how he felt it tested his stamina, his sanity. He felt he was going to lose his sanity with the confusion of knowing and caring about his wife. But he said one of the most beautiful statements I've ever heard. In the letter he wrote me, he said, "But there came a time when I went from being a caregiver to being a love giver." And he learned to love his wife for the way she was in a way that so impressed me. He's a man who inspires me by the way he loved his wife. I didn't help him, he helped me. Now he calls me his rock, and I don't understand that because I am not worthy of that. But he just suffered greatly, but he became a love giver over and above being a caregiver. I don't know if everybody can do that, but I salute this gentleman profoundly who and he wants to write, like Jason helps people going through grief. This guy, and Marcia, I respect you for what you're doing too, wants to help people who are caregivers now too because of what they're going through.
Thank you, and that's why we're all in this together, to help each other. The only thing that we can do is be helpful and be of service. And I think being of service to somebody really helps us as much as it helps the person that we're serving. So if we could all find a way how to help or serve another person, it doesn't have to be a gigantic thing. It can be as simple as, smiling to a stranger on the street because you don't know what that person's going through. And a smile, a nice, genuine smile from a stranger could just uplift their day. And we don't know what people are going through, but we can do small things with great love, like Mother Teresa said, to quote her. And this has been so wonderful to have both of you on the program today. I appreciate both of you sharing with your expertise, Pastor Dan, and with your experiences, Jason, that you've been going through, and the fact that you're willing to open up and talk about it, and it helps the healing process, and that you are in that healing phase of the grief. I so appreciate you. And if is there a way that someone could know about your workshops if they wanted to find out more about it?
Right now we have the easiest way. The easiest way to get a hold of us is just by sending an email to grief@mtnvw.org. That's the abbreviation for Mountain View. So if you just send an email to grief@mtnvw.org, that is one way to get a hold of us. Or you can reach me at dan@bestcareministry.com.
Okay, that's great. That's wonderful. Well, again, I appreciate you, both of you, so much for sharing your stories and your knowledge and your experiences, because we're helping people. We don't know who we're helping right this minute, but hopefully we are helping people, and continue to do the good work, both of you, Pastor Dan, Jason. It was awesome to have you. So I hope you have a good rest of the year and a happy holiday, or happy as it can be. And best wishes to both of you.
And to you.
Thank you.
And
to you as well,
Marcia, in this very difficult time in our nation with COVID and election turmoil and everything, if everybody followed your advice, we'd be a happier country. If we just took a little time to care about somebody. Nothing makes a person feel more empowered than to care. It isn't the care receiver that's blessed, it's the caregiver that's blessed. And so you just keep up the good work because it's valuable. Thank you for having us on.
Oh, thank you. And thank you all to you all who have tuned in today. I hope you have a good evening. Don't forget to ask for your free copy of the 36-Hour Day book. And we will be back with another program next Tuesday, 6:04 p.m. Eastern Time. So stay tuned for that. And have a good night, everybody. And we'll see you next time on the Caregiver Solutions Info Show at caregiversolutions.info. Take care, everybody.
Thanks for joining us for this week's Caregiver Solutions with Marcia Teal. Join us next week as Marcia, who has 15 years of Alzheimer's disease and dementia care experience, brings you more needed information to help with the care of your loved one. This show can be seen again on caregiversolutions.info, and questions can be left on the site, which may be used on the program to help others. See you next week for more Caregiver Solutions.